Thank you so much, Sir John Reed. And now, for the last one. Take note that the virtual floor will be for Mom.
And last but not the least is a teacher who loves to read. Currently, she is now 30 years old and she teaches in Balibago Integrated High School. And now, she will be the one to tackle and to discuss the last part of the discussion about Ferdinand de Saussure. Ladies and gentlemen, she's no other than Ma'am Eloise Carapueda.
Good morning, Ma'am Medrano and classmates. This is my report about language as a system of relations. Rapport syntagmatics as associative and kindred notions. Saussure emphasis on the systematic nature of language and the various concepts associated with this claim point to the damaging effect of the procedure of abstracting isolated aspects, so characteristic of post-Saussurean development in linguistics, frequently neglected that the Saussure's idea about language must be taken as a whole, just like an attempt to construct a complete general theory of language which will be the object of linguistic science. Saussure's concern to make linguistics an autonomous science independent of psychology, sociology, and other social sciences, like history, led him to suggest the science of sign system. Example, the semiology. His step was to define the proper object of this particular science of linguistics, and it has been in the definition of Lang that the concept of system took its appropriate place. He was much concerned about the unity of linguistics, did not allow him to abandon historical linguistics in favor of non-historical linguistics, but his conviction that the linguist cannot escape the facts of language change. Saussure's methodology, it is an approach to the reality of language. He frequently took a rationalist position, Delang and Perrault. His concern to the second step, to relate his theory of language of the actual facts. First, on his methodology, he stresses the discrete nature of these two aspects to the extent that he termed distinction and antimony. It focuses synchrony, language as a system of science, diachrony, historical linguistics. His second step attempts to reconcile these two aspects by proposing a panchronic view of language. When we say panchronic, designated or relating to a linguistic structure or theory that may apply to all languages at all stages of their development, although it must be noted that he did not wish to attribute this generalizing aspect to status comparable to that other two. Let us view this synchrony-diachrony distinction on the short introduction of Ferdinand de Saussure of his concept to structural linguistics.
A radical new theory of language as a structured system. He is often referred to as the father of modern linguistics, an honour divided between him and Noam Chomsky, depending on who you ask. His most influential work, Course in General Linguistics, was published posthumously in 1916. But what is structural linguistics? It's the idea that language is a system of contrast and equivalence. In structural linguistics, language consists of strings of linguistic objects, be they words, phonemes, or morphemes, and these objects are defined only through the fact that they contrast with other objects in the language system. This was an entirely new way of thinking about languages and presented a radical change from previous approaches. In order to begin to understand structural linguistics, we first need to understand the key ideas. First, there's the sign. Saussure's sign consists of the signifier and the signified. The signifier is the sounds or the letters used to denote what we're talking about. The signified is the actual concept of the thing. That is, the idea in our minds when we hear or read the signifier. The actual real thing in the world is called the referent. Note the difference between the thought of a cat and an actual real cat. The sign is a two-sided psychological entity, as one can't exist without the other. It just couldn't be a sign. Imagine a coin with just one side. You can't, right? Secondly, Saussure highlights that there is an arbitrary and conventional relationship between a signifier and its signified. Arbitrary because there's no natural reason why we call a cat, and that's why different languages have different words for the same thing. The convention of language refers to the idea that a speech community needs to adhere to the same connections between a signifier and its signified. For example, English speakers all share a very similar concept of cat when they hear that word. I can't just start calling a cat a dog and expect anyone to know what I'm talking about. Thirdly, Saussure distinguishes between the use of language, parole, and the system of language, langue. Langue, being the system of language such as syntax or phonology, is an abstract system. Parole, on the other hand, is the use of that language, and this is an individual matter. Have you noticed that people have their own language quirks? Well, this is the individual side, the actual use of language. Fourthly, Saussure distinguishes between synchrony and diachrony. Synchrony refers to a complete language system at just one point in time. Think of it as a snapshot of language. Diachrony, on the other hand, is how that language develops over time. This is also known as historical linguistics. You may have noticed changes in language over your lifetime, with different words appearing or disappearing, or slight pronunciation changes. That's diachrony. The fifth and final thing we'll go over is the paradigm and the syntagm. They represent two axes used to describe languages. The syntagm is the linear pattern or sequence of linguistic objects. For example, the words in a sentence, "The cat sat on the mat." It can also be the sounds in a word, for example, clay. This axis is essentially one of contrast. You can't swap words around in the sentence without scrambling the meaning, and likewise, you can't swap the letters in clay around without destroying the arbitrary connection between the signifier and the signified. The paradigm refers to a group of linguistic objects which have similarities and that can replace one another in the syntagm. Take the earlier syntagm, "the cat sat on the mat." You can replace cat with dog or baby, but in this particular syntagm you can't use a word like fish. Fish just can't sit. But in a different syntagm, they could be used to replace cat. For example, in the syntagm, "I like all animals, especially fish." So just because some objects have a paradigmatic relationship in one specific syntagm, doesn't mean that it holds in all contexts. Let's look at another example using sounds in the word clay. In this syntagm, the C can be replaced by P to produce play, but we can't replace the C with a T. English doesn't allow the TL sequence. Another syntagm, still. Here we can replace the T with a P to produce the syntagm spill. The T and the P belong to the same paradigm in this example. The axes of the syntagm and the paradigm are key to understanding what Saussure means when he talks about meaning depending on the systems of a language. So, why is any of this interesting? Well, until Saussure started forming his ideas about language, the study of language was laden with belief. Saussure stressed that language was structural, thereby freeing it from associations, be they social, cultural, political, historical. Practically, this approach to language means that it is studied based on structural relations alone. A linguistic object's meaning is understood through its contrast with other linguistic objects in the system. Language is therefore a static system of these interconnected linguistic objects.
His concept of system in language is concerned, it is not sufficient to know that this notion is at the heart of his linguistic theory, but that he approached this idea from every possible angle in order to substantiate his claim. Basis of Saussure concept of system. Later on, this became important features of his general linguistic theory, in particular the idea that a given item has its existence and value. In his book, Memoir on the Original System of Vowels in the Indo-European Language, he explained how the nucleus of vowel alterations in Indo-European, like those take place. Traditional ideas about the systematic nature of language. Since advances in the natural science by the 19th century, It is no surprise that the term organism should have gained wide acceptance in the linguistic scholarship of the past century, a term which Saussure himself used quite frequently as synonymous with system. His revealing statements from Gabelins Praxenschaft, 2nd edition, 1901. System and organic are nicely collocated. The interdependence of linguistic elements in the prime characteristic of language. Absence of an element or its change would affect the whole. Observation which may call to mind Saussure's famous simile of language with a game of chess. According to Grauer Brugmann, 1904, Cours Vigilance, Grammatik, his book, The Concept of Language as a System of Mutually Related Elements was in the air at the time when Saussure formulated his linguistic theory. Giving evidence of a growing interest in more general consideration of language study, however, Saussure could not have received much support from their findings for his own conviction. Saussure's suggestion concerning the systematic of language. The cornerstone of his doctrine, language is a system in which all terms are united and of the value of one result only from simultaneous presence of others. Written in his course, 1911. From Godel quote, a vivid more idea of his lecture. In order to distinguish between phonology and morphology, as given in the video a while ago, it is having different purposes within linguistic investigation. It is set up principle that with the former one has to consider the same shape at different days, the diachronic axis, various shape on the same date, synchronic axis. In this context, Saussure excluded etymology by the virtue of the fact that it does not represent a specific order of research, nor a specific ordering of linguistic facts, and in its activity made use of both phonology and morphology so that one may infer that he regarded this branch of language study not to be an essential part of linguistic science. It is widely stated in the video, morphology one has to consider, compare, and analyze signs, which belong to the system and claims, after having stated that the speaker is conscious of the sounds as a sign only. In all state language, speaking subjects are aware of morphological units. He cited examples. 3 examples. 1. Creator of the action. Graveur, engraver. Fencer, tinker. Porteur, carrier. So sa EUR, it connotes the creator of the action. Neologism, newly expressions. So from that word, some are being formed, newly expressions. Ausseur, daring, commencer, to begin.